Welcome, everyone. Today, we've got a truly fascinating explainer mapped out for you. We're going to be taking a close look at a deeply personal, honestly pretty epic spiritual transition. It's documented in a text titled, My Story, From the Kingdom Hall to Kundalini, and it chronicles the life of Anthony Eichner Alvarez. We're going to trace his incredible journey, starting from being born into a very strict, highly controlled religious institution, all the way through his formal expulsion, his ravenous search for meaning, and ultimately his work building a completely independent synthesis of spiritual traditions. It's a profound look at what happens when a person's entire framework of reality collapses, only for them to build a completely new foundation, literally from the ground up.
Okay, let's dive into this. Right at the very beginning of his document, Alvarez places this famous Bible verse, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Now, as a kid growing up inside his institution, he was taught that these words had very firm, strict boundaries. The truth was completely conditional, It was entirely defined by the organization. But as you'll see, by the time he writes this account in 2026, those exact same words have taken on a totally boundaryless, unconditional meaning for him. To really grasp how that massive shift happened, we have to understand exactly where he started.
Section 1. Inside the Kingdom Hall. The status quo of total architecture.
So, Alvarez was born in 1996 into a family of sincerely believing Jehovah's Witnesses. He grew up in an environment of what you could call total architecture. This means every single doctrine, every friendship, every social rule, the whole shebang was strictly controlled from a central organization in Brooklyn. He didn't actively choose this path, he was simply born right into it. And he writes this really striking line, "When the questions themselves feel dangerous, you have already learned something important about the institution you're inside." By the time he was old enough to just naturally start asking questions, he quickly realized that the very act of questioning was treated as a dangerous threat to that total architecture.
Section 2. The cracks and the expulsion, when the foundation fractures.
Now, his stats didn't just happen overnight. They accumulated slowly. He started discovering translation biases in their specific Bible that seemed intentionally designed to support predetermined conclusions. He also started noticing the severe human costs of these doctrines, like families refusing life-saving blood transfusions based strictly on organizational rules. And this brilliantly illustrates the structural issues he was uncovering. Look at these dates. The organization had predicted the literal end of the world multiple times, in 1914, 1925, and 1975. Yet after every single one of those failed apocalyptic predictions, instead of admitting fault, the institution actually demanded even more trust and loyalty from its followers. When your entire social world is built inside an institution, seeing these failures so clearly creates an absolute existential crisis. Because if the organization is wrong, everything built on top of it is fractured.
Ultimately, this questioning led to his expulsion. He was what they call disfellowshipped. This is a formal expulsion from the community, and the mechanics of it are just completely devastating. All members, and yes, this includes your own family members who remain inside, are officially instructed to have absolute zero social contact with you. Alvarez explains that this process essentially weaponizes a person's most intimate relationships, using them as leverage for compliance. It forces you into total, crushing isolation. He describes this period as feeling literally like a death. Not a physical death of himself, but the death of the entire world he had ever known.
But from that total loss of identity, he writes something incredibly profound. He says the thing about hitting the ground is that you finally know where the ground is. When that institutional framework was completely ripped away, he fell into the abyss of losing his community and his beliefs. Yet in that empty space, what he discovered was that this ground actually turned out to be a much more solid foundation than anything he had ever been standing on before.
Section 3. Searching the mystics, an unrestricted diet.
Hitting that ground sparked a ravenous search for truth. Alvarez started consuming absolutely everything, from scholarly Bible history to neuroscience to quantum physics, and, most unexpectedly, he began reading the mystics. Now, these were texts he had previously been explicitly taught were dangerous and deceptive. So the crucial point is the sheer contrast between these two paradigms. On the left, you have the institutional truth of his past. It was controlled, it was extrinsic, and it was entirely based on getting permission from a central authority. But on the right, the mystic truth he was discovering in texts like the Upanishads, the Gnostic Gospels, and writers like Rumi and Meister Eckhart. That truth was direct, it was interior, and it was unbidden. He found that the mystics offered the most honest engagement with spiritual reality he had ever encountered. He was finally finding a framework to understand those genuine moments of stillness he had felt throughout his life, completely outside the rigid rules of his old world.
Section 4. The Nissan 14 Awakening, direct contact.
Everything for him shifted around a highly specific date, Nissan 14. Now, this is the date on the Hebrew calendar that corresponds to Passover, which was a night Alvarez had meticulously observed as the memorial every single year inside his former religion. But on a Nissan 14 following his expulsion, this sudden, completely unbidden experience arrived. It didn't prove some new doctrine. It permanently dissolved his need for one. The exact thing he had been searching for, direct contact with something sacred, had arrived directly through his own interior. He didn't need permission from any earthly authority. And ironically, it arrived on the very date that had been so heavily regimented by his former religion.
The precise term he later found to describe this event is a Kundalini awakening. As the text defines it, this is a sudden, involuntary surge of energy through the body, accompanied by an interior knowing and direct contact with presence. Now, impartially reporting on this, Alvarez describes his lived experience as being absolutely unmistakable and undeniable. It wasn't a voice in his head or a visual hallucination, but a fundamental, visceral contact with presence. He didn't even know what to call it in the moment, but it permanently changed his trajectory.
Section 5. The Perennial Truth Library. Synthesizing the experience.
Let's move to and see how this builds into his final stage. After Nissan 14, he wasn't looking for permission to believe anymore. He wanted a map for the profound territory he had just touched. He wanted to understand this experience both rationally and historically. So he started connecting the dots across incredibly diverse world traditions. He looked at Kundalini energy in Hindu and Tantric text, divine light in Kabbalistic accounts, and the dissolving of boundaries in Rumi's Sufi poetry. He explored the soul's return to the Godhead in Meister Eckhart's Christian mysticism and the recognition of pure awareness in Tibetan Dzogchen. He recognized that while these traditions use very different metaphors, they were all pointing at the exact same interior human territory. And he collected all of this research into what he calls the Perennial Truth Library. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the powerful metaphor Alvarez lands on for anyone who has been pushed out of an institution, but still feels a lingering desire for spiritual truth. He writes, "The hunger is not the problem, the hunger is the compass." He argues that the deep grief of losing your community, combined with the immense relief of no longer having to fake belief, leaves you with a profound hunger. And that hunger isn't some pathology to be cured or distracted away. It is actually a vital, guiding signal pointing at something very real. And that brings us to the core thesis of the Perennial Truth Library. Alvarez built this synthesis specifically for the spiritually hungry outcasts, people who have lost everything they thought was protecting them. His ultimate takeaway here is that the divine has always been accessible, and no earthly institution has ever owned that access. As he puts it, the truth doesn't need your loyalty, it just needs your attention. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought, directly echoing the source material's ultimate call to action. What happens when you stop looking for permission and start looking for what is actually true? Anthony Eichner Alvarez's journey suggests that while the initial fall might literally cost you everything, the ground you eventually hit is far more solid, allowing you to live authentically and completely without bounds. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep looking for what is actually true.